The people in these cases made a choice that most people never have to think about. They decided to cooperate with the federal government against the most violent criminal organizations on the planet. Some were DEA agents, some were pilots, some were drug traffickers who switched sides, some were private consultants just trying to help a friend. Some were ordinary people in the wrong place at the wrong time who saw something they were never supposed to see. Every single one of them paid for that choice with their life. What follows is 10 cases spanning 4 decades and 5 cartels. From a DEA agent tortured for 30 hours in Guadalajara in 1985, to a federal witness shot 5 times in the head at a Colombian restaurant in 2025. 10 people who trusted that the system they were helping would keep them safe. In most of these cases, it did not. Today we are covering federal informants and cooperating witnesses killed by cartels. Case 1. Kiki Camarena. Enrique Camarena was born on July 26, 1947, in Mexicali, Mexico. His family was poor. They moved to Calexico, California when he was a child, and he grew up there, eventually becoming a U.S. citizen. His friends called him Kiki. After high school, he joined the U.S. Marine Corps, served 2 years, then came back to Calexico and worked as a firefighter before joining the Calexico Police Department. He moved on to narcotics work with the Imperial County Sheriff Department, and that experience pushed him toward the DEA, which he joined in 1974. He was assigned first to Calexico, then to Fresno. In 1981, he got transfer orders to Guadalajara, Mexico. Guadalajara in the early 1980s was one of the most dangerous postings a DEA agent could have. The Guadalajara Cartel, run by Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo, Rafael Caro Quintero, and Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, controlled the majority of drug trafficking across Mexico. They moved enormous quantities of marijuana and cocaine into the United States, and they did it with the open support of corrupt Mexican police, politicians, and intelligence officials. The cartel operated with near-total protection from the Dirección Federal de Seguridad, Mexico's federal intelligence agency, whose officers provided security, badges, and cover for the traffickers. Kiki spent 4.5 years in Guadalajara building a network of informants and chasing the cartel's money trail. He was good at it. Colleagues said nobody in the Guadalajara office could match his ability to get people to trust him. His work led to bank account seizures, intelligence on major trafficking routes, and eventually to one of the biggest drug busts in history up to that point. In November 1984, acting on intelligence that Kiki had developed, 450 Mexican soldiers backed by helicopters raided a 2,500-acre marijuana plantation in the state of Chihuahua known as Rancho Buffalo. The plantation belonged to Caro Quintero. Authorities burned more than 10,000 tons of marijuana. The loss was estimated at between $150 and $160 million. For the cartel, it was a disaster. For Caro Quintero personally, it was a humiliation he was not willing to absorb quietly. The cartel's leadership identified Kiki as the man who had led investigators to the ranch. They decided he needed to die for it. On Thursday, February 7, 1985, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Kiki left the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara to meet his wife Mika for lunch. He was 37 years old. He and Mika had 3 sons, Enrique, Daniel, and Eric. He was 3 weeks away from being reassigned back to the United States. As he walked toward his truck, 5 men surrounded him, shoved him into a beige Volkswagen, threw a jacket over his head, and drove away. Nobody at the consulate intervened. A U.S. consulate employee had actually helped the cartel men spot him as he came out. At almost the same hour, a Mexican pilot named Alfredo Zavala Avelar was grabbed near the Guadalajara airport. Zavala had flown surveillance missions with Kiki over the cartel's marijuana operations for years. He knew what they knew. The cartel took him too. Both men were driven to a house at 881 Lope de Vega in the Jardines del Bosque neighborhood of Guadalajara. The house belonged to Rafael Caro Quintero. Inside that house, Kiki Camarena was tortured for more than 30 hours. The sessions were recorded on tape. Investigators later found those tapes. The lead interrogator was Sergio Espino Verdin, the head of the secret police in Guadalajara. He asked Kiki about DEA operations, about which Mexican officials were under investigation, about how much American law enforcement actually knew. The cartel brought a doctor into the house to administer drugs, including adrenaline injected directly, to keep Kiki conscious through the beatings. His skull was crushed with a piece of rebar. His jaw, nose, cheekbones, and windpipe were broken. His ribs were broken. When he passed out, the doctor brought him back. This continued for over a day. Kiki Camarena was killed on approximately February 9, 1985. Zavala was killed alongside him. Their bodies were wrapped in plastic, bound, blindfolded, and gagged. The cartel buried them first near Guadalajara, then dug them up and moved them to avoid the investigation. They were found on March 5, 1985, by a farmer working his fields near the small town of La Angostura in the state of Michoacán, about 60 miles southeast of Guadalajara. A forensic examination confirmed both men had died from extensive injuries. The torture recordings recovered from Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo's beach house later became key evidence in the prosecutions that followed. The U.S. reaction was immediate and enormous. The DEA shut down border crossings, effectively halting all vehicle traffic between the U.S. and Mexico until pressure forced them back open. The investigation that followed, called Operation Leyenda, meaning Operation Legend, became the largest homicide investigation the DEA had ever launched. A special task force was dispatched to Mexico. Suspects were tracked across multiple countries. In some cases, DEA agents used bounty hunters to physically seize suspects in Mexico and bring them across the border, which caused its own diplomatic crisis with the Mexican government. Rafael Caro Quintero fled Mexico 9 days after the murders, on March 9, 1985, and made it to Costa Rica. He was arrested there on April 4, 1985, and sent back to Mexico. He was convicted of ordering Kiki's kidnapping, torture, and murder, and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo was arrested in Puerto Vallarta in April 1985, and also convicted, also sentenced to 40 years. Miguel Ángel Félix Gallardo had political protection that shielded him for 4 more years before he was finally arrested in 1989. He was convicted and sentenced to 40 years as well. Then, in 2013, after serving 28 years, Caro Quintero walked free. A Mexican federal tribunal ruled that he had been tried in the wrong court, federal instead of state, and ordered his immediate release. The ruling enraged U.S. officials. The Obama administration issued a public statement. The DEA put him back on its most wanted list. He went straight back to drug trafficking and spent the next 9 years evading capture while running operations in the state of Sonora. Mexican Marines caught him again in July 2022 in a raid that cost 14 Mexican soldiers their lives when their helicopter crashed during the operation. He was kept in custody in Mexico for nearly 3 more years. On February 27, 2025, 40 years after Kiki Camarena was murdered, Rafael Caro Quintero was extradited to the United States. He was arraigned in New York federal court on February 28, 2025, on charges that include orchestrating Kiki's death as part of a continuing criminal enterprise. He has pleaded not guilty. As part of the case, the DOJ is required to turn over to defense attorneys the audio recordings made during Kiki's torture, recordings that have never been heard publicly. Kiki's wife, Mika, and their 3 sons have been waiting for that day in an American courtroom for 4 decades. Their son, Enrique Jr., became a judge in the San Diego Superior Court. In March 2025, the family filed a separate civil lawsuit against the Sinaloa Cartel, the successor organization to the Guadalajara Cartel, and against Caro Quintero, Fonseca Carrillo, and Felix Gallardo personally, seeking damages for Kiki's murder. Every October, schools across the United States observe Red Ribbon Week, a drug awareness campaign started in 1985 in Kiki's hometown of Calexico to honor him after his death. 40 years later, the man who ordered his killing is finally facing trial in the country Kiki spent his life protecting. The pilot taken from the Guadalajara airport that same afternoon, Alfredo Zavala Avelar, was tortured in the same house, killed the same day, and buried in the same grave. He was not a DEA agent. He was a Mexican government pilot who had spent years flying surveillance missions for Kiki. The cartel killed him because he knew too much and because they could. His story comes next. Case 2. Alfredo Zavala Avelar. Alfredo Zavala Avelar was a Mexican government pilot. He worked for the Mexican Ministry of Agriculture, flying aerial surveillance missions as part of a drug eradication program in the early 1980s. He was not a DEA agent. He was not a law enforcement officer. He was a pilot who flew planes and took photographs from the air. And that work put him in the crosshairs of the most powerful drug cartel in Mexico. The connection between Zavala and the DEA came through Kiki Camarena. The two men knew each other, and Zavala had been quietly providing the DEA with information he gathered during his government flights, reporting the movements of private aircraft carrying cartel members in and out of Guadalajara, and sharing reconnaissance photographs he had taken over cartel-controlled land. He was, in the language of law enforcement, a DEA asset. He knew things. He had seen things from the air that most people on the ground never would. That made him useful. It also made him a target. When Camarena needed aerial photographs of Rancho Buffalo, Rafael Caro Quintero's 500-acre marijuana plantation in the state of Chihuahua, it was Zavala who flew him over it. The photographs Zavala took from that plane helped confirm the scale of the operation and provided the intelligence that led to the November 1984 military raid. Mexican soldiers burned more than 10,000 tons of marijuana. The loss to Caro Quintero was estimated at around $160 million. The cartel had been humiliated, and they knew it was Camarena who had led the authorities to the ranch. What they also knew was that Camarena had not gone up there alone. There had been a pilot. On February 7, 1985, the same afternoon that 5 men shoved Camarena into a beige Volkswagen outside the U.S. consulate in Guadalajara, a separate group of cartel operatives grabbed Zavala near the Guadalajara airport. He had just landed and was getting into his car when they took him. The 2 men were seized within the same hour at different locations by different teams, a coordinated operation that had been planned in advance. Zavala was driven to the same house where Camarena was being held, 881 Lope de Vega, in the Jardines del Bosque neighborhood, a house owned by Caro Quintero. Inside that house, both men were tortured for more than 30 hours. Kiki received food and water during the sessions. Zavala received nothing. The lead interrogator, Sergio Espino Verdin, the head of Guadalajara's secret police, focused his questions on Camarena, on what the DEA knew, on which Mexican officials were under investigation. A doctor was brought in to administer drugs and keep both men conscious. According to sources documenting the events, Camarena at some point during the ordeal was taken out of the room and encountered Zavala and apologized to him for getting him involved. Zavala was not the cartel's primary target. He had no DEA badge. He was not running an investigation into anyone. He flew a plane, and he took photographs, and he told a DEA agent what he saw from the air. That was the sum of his involvement. But the cartel did not make distinctions between agents and assets, between those who led investigations and those who quietly provided information from a cockpit. To them, Zavala knew too much and had helped Camarena do too much damage. Killing Camarena without also killing the pilot who had flown with him would have been leaving a loose end. Both men were dead by approximately February 9, 1985. Their bodies were wrapped in plastic, bound, blindfolded, and gagged. The cartel buried them, then dug them up and moved them to a different location, an attempt to mislead investigators about where they had been held. On March 5, 1985, a farmer working fields near the town of La Angostura in the state of Michoacán found the two bodies in a shallow grave. They were about 60 miles southeast of Guadalajara. A coroner examined Zavala's remains and confirmed the identification. A forensic examination found that both men had died from extensive injuries, head and neck trauma consistent with prolonged and severe beating. The world learned Kiki Camarena's name. The DEA launched Operation Leyenda in his honor. A federal court in Los Angeles charged 22 defendants in connection with the two murders. Schools across the United States began observing Red Ribbon Week every October to honor Kiki's memory. Zavala's name appeared in court documents in the lawsuit filed 40 years later by Kiki's family, in the charges against Caro Quintero after his extradition to the United States in February 2025. Rafael Caro Quintero was formally charged in connection with the kidnapping and murder of both men. But in the decades of public memory, news coverage, and documentary filmmaking that followed, it has almost always been Camarena whose story is told. Zavala is the footnote, the pilot, the friend, the man who was also in the car. He was taken because the cartel could not leave someone alive who had seen what he had seen and helped with what he had helped with. His death was not incidental. It was deliberate. He was grabbed at the airport within the same hour as Camarena by a separate team as part of the same operation. The cartel planned for him specifically. The next case on this list involves a man who, unlike Zavala, was no quiet asset working from the shadows. Barry Seal was one of the most valuable and most visible informants the DEA ever had. A former commercial pilot turned cocaine smuggler who went undercover at the highest level of the Medellin cartel, personally photographed Pablo Escobar loading cocaine onto a plane, and then got outed by a front-page newspaper story that left him with no protection and nowhere to hide. Case 3. Barry Seal. Adler Berryman Seal was born on July 16, 1939 in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. He got his student pilot certificate at 16, his private pilot license at 17, and his flight instructor called him a naturally gifted pilot. By 1968, he was a flight engineer at Trans World Airlines. None of that was enough for him. By 1976, he had started smuggling small quantities of marijuana by air. By 1978, he had moved to cocaine. Because, as he later said to the DEA, it was pound for pound more profitable than weed. Over the next several years, Seal built one of the largest drug smuggling operations in American history. He flew cocaine from Colombia into the United States, earning as much as $500,000 per flight. By 1983, his personal earnings from drug trafficking totaled an estimated $60 million. He had made more than 100 flights and illegally imported an estimated 56 tons of cocaine into the country. The cartel knew him only by his alias, Ellis Mackenzie. They had no photograph of him. They did not know his real name. That gap between who he was and what they thought he was would become both his greatest asset and, eventually, the thing that got him killed. In late 1983, Seal was caught. He was indicted in Florida on charges related to smuggling quaaludes and laundering money, convicted, and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. His sentence was later reduced to time served because of an agreement he reached with prosecutors, in exchange for becoming a DEA informant starting in March 1984. The Philadelphia Inquirer would later call him the most important witness in the history of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. The undercover operation that followed was extraordinary. The DEA equipped Seal's plane with hidden cameras and sent him back to Colombia. On April 8, 1984, he flew to the Ochoa family's estate in Medellin and sat in a meeting with the entire cartel leadership, including Pablo Escobar, for the first time. None of them knew that Ellis Mackenzie was also Barry Seal, DEA informant. Escobar outlined plans to move cocaine through a Nicaraguan military airstrip. Seal flew to Nicaragua, loaded cocaine onto his plane with Sandinista soldiers and cartel members present, and the hidden cameras captured all of it, including a photograph of Pablo Escobar himself on the tarmac. It was the first confirmed image of Escobar connecting him directly to cocaine trafficking. Seal delivered the cocaine and the film to the U.S. government on a flight to Homestead Air Force Base in Florida. Then, on July 17, 1984, a front-page story ran in the Washington Times. The article, written by journalist Edmund Jacoby, detailed Seal's infiltration of the Medellin cartel and included the photograph of Escobar. Barry Seal was now publicly named as a government informant. The cartel knew immediately who Ellis Mackenzie really was. The DEA cut him loose. He was no longer useful as an undercover operative. He refused to enter the federal witness protection program. His attorney, Louis Unglesby, later said Seal believed he was smarter than the Ochoas and underestimated how far they were willing to go. Instead of disappearing, Seal stayed in Baton Rouge, testified in front of a federal grand jury against Escobar, the Ochoa brothers, and others, and cooperated in additional cases. His testimony was the foundation of the first U.S. drug trafficking indictment ever filed against Escobar and the Ochoas. It was also the basis of extradition proceedings against Jorge Ochoa, who had been arrested in Spain. In January 1986, Seal appeared before Louisiana Judge Frank Palazola for sentencing on the remaining drug charges. Palazola made clear his contempt. He called people like Seal the lowest, most despicable he could think of. He sentenced Seal to 5 years probation, with the condition that he spend every night, 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., at the Salvation Army Community Treatment Center on Airline Highway in Baton Rouge for the first 6 months. He also stipulated that Seal, as a convicted felon, could not carry a gun or hire armed bodyguards. Unglesby stood up in court and told the judge that this ruling amounted to a death sentence for his client. Seal himself told friends that the judge had made him a clay pigeon. The cartel had already placed a $500,000 contract on his death. According to testimony later given in court by cartel associate Max Mermelstein, both Pablo Escobar and Fabio Ochoa personally called to thank Mermelstein for accepting the contract on their behalf. The judge had now published Seal's precise location and daily schedule to anyone paying attention. On February 12, 1986, 1 week before the murder, Bernardo Antonio Vasquez flew from Miami to New Orleans on Eastern Airlines and checked into the New Orleans Airport Hilton. He rented an Oldsmobile from Avis. 4 days later, on February 16th, Miguel Velez arrived from Miami on a second Eastern Airlines flight, checked into the same hotel, and Vasquez rented a second vehicle, a Lincoln Town Car from Budget. Luis Carlos Quintero Cruz entered the United States separately, crossing illegally through Mexico. On the evening of February 19, 1986, exactly 3 weeks into his court-ordered sentence, Barry Seal pulled his car into the parking lot of the Salvation Army Center. A man stepped out from behind the donation drop boxes, walked toward the car, and opened fire with a suppressed MAC-10 submachine gun. Seal was hit 6 times and died almost instantly. He was 46 years old. Multiple eyewitnesses at the scene identified Quintero Cruz as the shooter. Velez was identified as the driver of the getaway vehicle. Vasquez had organized the logistics, the hotel rooms, the rental cars, the weapons. All 3 men's fingerprints were recovered from the getaway vehicle. 6 Colombians were arrested in total. 3, Quintero Cruz, Velez, and Vasquez, were indicted in East Baton Rouge Parish on charges of first-degree murder. Due to the massive pre-trial publicity in Baton Rouge, the trial was moved to Lake Charles. After a 5-week trial, the jury unanimously convicted all 3. On May 13, 1987, each was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Velez died in the hospice unit at Angola State Penitentiary in August 2015. Quintero Cruz applied for clemency in 2023, was denied by a 2-2 board vote, and remains in prison. Vasquez is also still serving his sentence. Pablo Escobar, Fabio Ochoa Vasquez, and Rafael Cardona Salazar were indicted in U.S. federal court for conspiring to murder Seal. None of them ever stood trial for it. Cardona Salazar was killed in an ambush in Colombia in December 1987. Escobar was killed by Colombian security forces in December 1993. Ochoa was eventually extradited to the U.S. in 2001 on separate drug charges, but the terms of the extradition agreement excluded crimes committed before 1997, which put the Seal murder off the table. He was convicted of drug trafficking and released from federal prison in 2024. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case on this list stayed entirely inside one house in the border city of Juarez for months. And the man responsible for what happened in that house was not a cartel member. He was a U.S. government informant on the American payroll. 12 people were killed, and the agency handling him knew about it. Case 4. The House of Death. Around 2 in the morning, sometime in early 2000, a Mexican man walked across the international bridge connecting El Paso, Texas, to Ciudad Juarez, Mexico, and asked to speak to a U.S. agent. His name was Guillermo Eduardo Ramirez Peiro. He was a former Mexican highway patrol officer. He told U.S. customs agents he wanted to work as an informant inside the Juarez cartel. The agent who took his call was Raul Bencomo. Bencomo assigned him informant number 913 and gave him the code name by which everyone would come to know him: Lalo. Over the next 2 years, Lalo proved genuinely valuable. He fed information to ICE, the agency U.S. Customs became when it was reorganized into Immigration and Customs Enforcement, as well as to the DEA, the ATF, and the FBI. By 2001 and 2002, he was reporting that a man named Heriberto Santillan Tabares ran day-to-day operations for the Juarez cartel in the city, and that Santillan was third in the entire organization behind the cartel's leader, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes. ICE built its investigation around that target. In March 2003, using Lalo's access, agents conducted a controlled delivery of 29 kilograms of cocaine belonging to Santillan, which led to 3 arrests and formed the basis of a federal indictment. Lalo also handed over Santillan's home address in the state of Durango and the phone number and location of a cartel safe house in Juarez. Then in June 2003, Lalo was caught at a Border Patrol checkpoint on Interstate 25 near Las Cruces, New Mexico, with 102 pounds of marijuana hidden inside the tires of his pickup truck. The DEA severed ties with him 2 days later. ICE did not. Instead, a Texas assistant U.S. attorney named Juanita Fielden, the lead prosecutor on the Santillan case, called state prosecutors, and the drug charges against Lalo were dropped. ICE kept him active. In August 2003, Santillan invited Lalo to a meeting at an abandoned house on Calle Parsioneros in eastern Juarez. The man who arrived at that house was a Mexican attorney named Fernando Reyes, a childhood friend of Santillan who had arranged to meet him to discuss moving a marijuana shipment. Santillan had no intention of doing business with Reyes. He planned to kill him and take the drugs. Inside the house, Santillan's corrupt police officers wrapped Reyes in duct tape and put a plastic bag over his head. When the men struggled to hold Reyes down, they looked at Lalo. He grabbed Reyes by the left leg and pulled him to the floor. The officers strangled Reyes, suffocated him, and beat his head with a shovel until his neck broke. Lalo had a hidden audio recorder running the entire time, supplied by his ICE handlers. He recorded the murder and brought the tape back to El Paso. Bencomo, Lalo's main handler, listened to the recording. By his own account, it made him so sick he had to go to the bathroom and vomit. He took the tape to his supervisor and said he did not wish to remain part of the case. His supervisor told him to make sure Lalo did not participate in any more killings. Lalo went back to Juarez. ICE continued paying him. The murders continued. Over the next several months, the cartel cell used the house on Calle Parsioneros for what Santillan's men called carne asadas, a Spanish term for barbecue that they used as a code word for planned killings. 11 more people were tortured and killed inside that house. Each time a killing was being planned, Lalo was told in advance using the code word. Each time, according to Lalo, he informed his ICE handlers. They did not intervene. He admitted in court documents to driving 2 of the victims to the house himself, knowing what would happen to them when they arrived. Among the dead was Luis Padilla, a legal U.S. resident, killed on January 14, 2004. 2 U.S. residents were among the 12 victims in total. In January 2004, while one man was being tortured inside the house, he gave his captors a false lead, claiming drugs were hidden at a house next door to a DEA agent's residence in Juarez. The cartel sent people to check. The DEA agent, realizing he had been identified, fled to El Paso with his wife and 2 children while being stopped by corrupt Mexican state police on Santillan's payroll during the escape. The DEA evacuated all of its agents from the Juarez office. That threat to a federal agent was what finally forced ICE to end the operation, not the 12 bodies in the house. On January 15, 2004, Lalo arranged a meeting with Santillan, telling him they needed to discuss cartel business. He lured Santillan to El Paso. El Paso police conducted a prearranged traffic stop and arrested him. Santillan later accepted a plea deal and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison for drug trafficking. In January 2004, Mexican investigators dug up the bodies from the house on Calle Parsioneros. 12 corpses were recovered. ICE had paid Lalo more than $220,000 over the course of his time as informant number 913. Former DEA Special Agent Phil Jordan, who later served as an expert witness in the civil suit filed by victims' families against ICE, said in the NPR investigation that every federal rule and regulation had been broken. He said Lalo had been given, in his words, a license to kill. Former agent Bencomo was later charged with making false statements in connection with his testimony about what Lalo had disclosed to him. Attorney Raul Loya, who represented the victims' families, described the ICE agents running the operation as El Paso's version of the Keystone Cops. The civil suit was eventually dismissed. Lalo was placed in solitary confinement in an ICE detention facility, not for the murders in Juarez, none of which he was charged with in the United States, but because ICE said he no longer had the legal right to remain in the country. He told NPR from detention that jail was preferable to being returned to Mexico, where the cartel was waiting for him. The next case involves a failure of a completely different kind. Not an informant who participated in the killings, but an entire town's population punished because a DEA agent shared the wrong intelligence with the wrong people. And the Zetas used that information to wipe out hundreds of civilians who had nothing to do with any of it. Case 5. The Allende Massacre. In the Dallas suburbs sometime before March 2011, DEA agent Richard Martinez was running an operation called Operation Too Legit to Quit. It had started with a traffic stop. Police had pulled over a truck and found $802,000 in cash, vacuum-packed and hidden inside the gas tank. The driver confessed he worked for someone he knew only as El Diablo. the devil. Martinez worked the lead and eventually identified El Diablo as Jose Vasquez Jr., a 30-year-old Dallas native who had started selling drugs in high school and was by 2011 the leading Zetas cocaine distributor in East Texas, moving truckloads of drugs, guns, and cash across the border every month. As Martinez prepared to arrest him, Vasquez slipped across the border into Mexico and sought shelter with contacts inside the Zetas cartel in the town of Allende, in the northern state of Coahuila, about 25 miles from the Texas border. Martinez and the assistant U.S. attorney handling the case, Ernest Gonzalez, saw it differently. Vasquez had left his wife and mother behind in Texas. That was leverage. They pressured him to cooperate, and what they wanted specifically were the trackable BlackBerry PIN codes for the phones of Miguel Angel Trevino, known as Z40, and his brother Omar Trevino, known as Z42. The Trevino brothers were the two most wanted leaders of the Zetas and had killed their way onto the top of the DEA's target list. To get those PIN codes, Vasquez turned to a Zetas lieutenant named Hector Moreno. Moreno's brother Gilberto was the driver who had been arrested with the $802,000 in the gas tank. Facing 20 years in prison, Gilberto had already confessed and named the Treviños. Vasquez had arranged for his own lawyer in Dallas to represent Gilberto and promised not to let anyone in the cartel know what Gilberto had said. Moreno repaid that favor by handing Vasquez the BlackBerry PIN codes for both brothers. Vasquez handed them to the DEA. The DEA then passed those PIN codes to a unit of the Mexican Federal Police called the Sensitive Investigative Unit, or SIU. The SIU was a specially trained, U.S.-funded intelligence task force that was supposed to be the safest, most vetted unit in Mexican law enforcement for sharing sensitive information. Multiple DEA agents would later tell investigators that the SIU had a long record of leaking information directly to the cartels. One senior DEA official had specifically warned against sharing the Trevino's PIN codes with the unit. That warning was not heeded. The Trevino brothers learned their phones had been compromised. They quickly traced the information back through the small number of people who had access to those PIN codes. They identified their targets as Vasquez and a man named Jose Luis Garza Gaitan, who had family connections to others in the network. Both men fled into the United States to cooperate with law enforcement, leaving their town behind them. The Zetas sent approximately 50 trucks into Allende on the evening of March 18, 2011. What followed lasted 3 days. The Zetas looted and burned 40 homes and 7 ranches across Allende and neighboring towns. They pulled people from their houses, beat them, and drove them to a ranch outside of town where they were killed. The bodies were loaded into a storage shed filled with hay, doused with fuel, and burned for hours. A senior investigator from the Coahuila State Prosecutor's Office later told ProPublica that witnesses described the bodies being incinerated in that barn for hours until there was nothing left to identify. On March 18th alone, the local emergency system in Allende and Piedras Negras received 1,451 calls for help. Not one was answered. Allende's fire chief at the time, Evaristo Trevino, later explained why. He said the only thing his team could do was stand down out of fear. He said they couldn't fight bullets with water. Municipal police from Allende were not only absent, court testimony later confirmed they actively assisted the Zetas, transporting kidnapped victims in police patrol vehicles to the ranch where they were killed. Among the dead were 81-year-old Olivia Martinez de la Torre and her 7-month-old great-grandson, Mauricio Espinosa. Mauricio's siblings, a 5-year-old girl named Andrea and a 3-year-old boy named Arturo, were later found at an orphanage in the nearby city of Piedras Negras. The Zetas had told the children that Mauricio cried too much to leave with them. No family lost more members than the Garzas. Nearly 20 members of the Garza family are believed dead. A definitive death toll has never been established. The DOJ's own sentencing documents state the total is believed to be at least 100 and possibly up to 300. For 3 years, the massacre was covered up. Residents who tried to report disappearances were told not to keep looking. Several families fled to the United States. It was not until 2014 that the Mexican government launched a formal search for remains, sending Army, Navy, state, and federal police to search for clandestine graves across the region. The DEA named Agent Richard Martinez its Agent of the Year in 2011, the same year the massacre happened. It took credit for eventually capturing both Trevino brothers, Miguel Angel in 2013 and Omar in 2015, but refused to say publicly what role, if any, the leaked PIN codes played in those captures. The DEA also refused to say whether it had ever investigated how the information got from the SIU to the Zetas. Martinez's supervisors and the DEA liaison who had shared the intelligence with the SIU both declined to be interviewed. The DEA spokesman flew twice from Washington to Texas to monitor Martinez's interviews with journalists. Ivan Reyes Arzate, the longtime commander of the SIU, turned himself in to U.S. federal authorities in 2017 and was convicted in 2018 of conspiring with drug cartels, the very organizations he had been funded and trained by the U.S. government to pursue. He had taken hundreds of thousands of dollars in bribes from the Sinaloa and Beltran-Leyva cartels during his 13 years running the unit. It remains unclear whether he was the specific source of the leak in the Allende case. Hugo Cesar Roman Chavarria, known as El Vecino, was a high-ranking Zetas member who witnesses testified traveled through Allende during the massacre, pointing out the homes of the informant's relatives and associates, marking them for the gunmen. He was extradited to the United States, pleaded guilty to drug trafficking in 2019, and was sentenced to life in prison by a federal judge in the Eastern District of Texas in September 2021. The next case involves a Colombian man who had no name in any public record, a DEA informant whose identity was handed directly to the Beltran-Leyva cartel by the man the U.S. government considered its most trusted partner in Mexico's entire federal police structure. Case 6. The Unnamed Colombian. Between 2007 and 2008, something started going wrong for the Beltran-Leyva organization. The cartel, led by brothers Arturo, Alfredo, and Hector Beltran-Leyva, had a smooth and profitable supply chain for moving cocaine from Colombia to Mexico. Colombian suppliers would travel by boat to international waters near Mexico, where cartel powerboats and submarines would meet them, take the cocaine on board, and bring it ashore. The system had worked reliably for years. Then, for a period of 6 to 7 months, the shipments stopped arriving. One after another, the powerboats and submarines were intercepted by the DEA at sea. The cocaine was confiscated. The Beltran-Leyva brothers were losing tens of millions of dollars in product, and they had no explanation for how the Americans were finding them. The brothers were certain of one thing: someone inside the operation was talking. Arturo Beltran-Leyva, the leader of the organization, ordered his people to find the leak. To do that, he went to the Mexican Federal Police, specifically to officials he had been paying bribes to for years. Those officials had the connections and the intelligence access to investigate. They started looking. The investigation led to Miami. A Colombian man had been detained there by the DEA and then released, as the court testimony later put it, for purposes of providing information regarding drug shipments. He was a DEA informant embedded inside the cartel's Colombian supply network. He had been providing the DEA with the intelligence that was allowing agents to intercept the shipments at sea. The cartel's contacts inside the federal police learned his identity. One of those contacts, according to testimony later given under oath in a U.S. federal courtroom, was Luis Cardenas Palomino, a senior federal police commander who worked directly under Mexico's Secretary of Public Security, Genaro Garcia Luna. According to testimony given by Sergio Villarreal Barragan, a former Beltran-Leyva lieutenant who cooperated with the DEA after his arrest in 2010, and was extradited to the United States in 2012. Cardenas Palomino met with Beltran Leyva leadership and other officials at a ranch in central Mexico. At that meeting, Cardenas Palomino told the group he had spoken with his boss and close friend, Garcia Luna. He said that Garcia Luna had obtained the informant's identity through a Mexican federal police officer stationed in Colombia. At the meeting, according to Villarreal Barragan's account, someone produced a cardboard binder containing a photograph of the Colombian man and information confirming he had been arrested in Miami and was cooperating with the DEA. Arturo Beltran Leyva looked at the photograph and became very angry. He ordered that the man be kidnapped. Two high-ranking Beltran Leyva lieutenants located the Colombian informant in a city in central Mexico, kidnapped him, and tortured him. According to the court record reviewed by The Intercept and first reported by Mexican journalist Anabel Hernandez, the man admitted under torture that he had been arrested in Miami and was cooperating with U.S. law enforcement. He was then killed. His name has never been made public. He does not appear in any official DEA record accessible to the public. He was a Colombian national working inside a Mexican cartel's supply chain, trying to help American federal agents stop cocaine from reaching the United States. And the man who helped get him killed was the person the U.S. government considered its most important law enforcement partner in Mexico. Genaro Garcia Luna served as Mexico's Secretary of Public Security from 2006 to 2012. He oversaw the federal police, the national prison system, and a vast intelligence network. He worked directly with the DEA, the FBI, the CIA, and the Department of Homeland Security. He was described by U.S. officials as an architect of the Mexican drug war and was treated as a trusted partner by Washington. Prosecutors at his trial called him the Sinaloa cartel's most valuable asset. An assistant U.S. attorney told the jury that Garcia Luna was not the same as El Chapo. He was worse, because he enabled El Chapo to exist. Villarreal Barragan testified that cartel members would deliver bribe payments to Garcia Luna's people at various locations in Mexico City, including at a French restaurant directly across the street from the U.S. Embassy. The payments came in suitcases and duffel bags of cash, sometimes stacked in bundles of $10,000 bills. Garcia Luna was arrested in Dallas, Texas on December 9, 2019. His trial in Brooklyn Federal Court began in January 2023. He was convicted on February 21, 2023, of all 5 counts against him, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise and 3 counts of conspiring to traffic cocaine. On October 9, 2024, U.S. District Judge Brian Cogan sentenced him to 38 years and 9 months in federal prison. He was 55 years old at sentencing. He maintained his innocence throughout the trial and blamed the conviction on false testimony by criminal witnesses. Garcia Luna was the highest-ranking Mexican official ever tried in the United States on drug corruption charges. The DEA has acknowledged that he damaged the agency's relationship with Mexican law enforcement in ways that were described in court as setting them back incredibly. The Colombian informant whose identity he allegedly helped expose, the man who was kidnapped, tortured, and killed so the Beltran Leyva cartel could protect its cocaine pipeline, was never named at trial. He has no monument, no public record, and no family statement on file. His death was mentioned in court as evidence against a former cabinet minister, and then the case moved on. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves a man whose name is also absent from the public record. A DEA confidential source kidnapped in Mexico in 2023, along with 10 other people by the personal security force of the Sinaloa cartel's leadership, 8 of whom were killed, including a 13-year-old boy. Case 7. El Nini and the DEA source. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was arrested in 2016 and extradited to the United States in 2017. He was convicted in 2019 and sentenced to life in prison plus 30 years. With their father gone, his sons, known collectively as the Chapitos or the Little Chapos, took control of their faction of the Sinaloa cartel. The four brothers, Ivan Archivaldo Guzman Salazar, Jesus Alfredo Guzman Salazar, Joaquin Guzman Lopez, and Ovidio Guzman Lopez, inherited the cartel's infrastructure and made it more violent than it had been under their father. They became the largest producers and exporters of fentanyl to the United States. To protect that operation, they needed a security force. The man they put in charge of it was Nestor Isidro Perez Salas. His nickname was El Niñi. The nickname comes from Mexican slang, ni trabaja ni estudia, meaning neither works nor studies, a term used to describe young people with no direction. Perez Salas was 32 years old at the time of his extradition. He commanded a unit of enforcers also called the Ninis, described in the federal indictment as a particularly violent group of security personnel for the Chapitos. According to court documents, the Ninis received military-style training across multiple areas of combat, including urban warfare, special weapons and tactics, and sniper proficiency. They were armed with machine guns and rocket launchers. The indictment against Perez Salas, filed in the Southern District of New York in April 2023, describes what his unit did to people who got in the Chapitos' way. Captured rivals were taken to ranches owned by the Chapitos for execution. Some victims were fed to tigers the Chapitos raised and kept as pets at the ranch, some while still alive. In 2017, Perez Salas and two of the Chapitos captured a Mexican federal law enforcement officer. They tortured him for 2 hours. They inserted a corkscrew into his muscles, ripped it out, and packed the open wounds with hot chiles. The officer was then shot dead by one of the Chapito brothers. That same year, Perez Salas and others captured 3 members of a rival cartel, Los Zetas. They were tortured before being interrogated and killed. In 2022, Perez Salas and another member of the unit took a woman and injected her repeatedly with fentanyl to test the potency of their product until she overdosed and died. In the summer of 2022, Perez Salas and associates sold fentanyl in Los Angeles that was later seized by the DEA. The DEA had been building a case against Perez Salas and his associates in the Southern District of New York. As part of that investigation, a confidential source had been providing information to law enforcement. Perez Salas found out. The indictment states plainly what happened next. In or about October 2023, Perez Salas and other sicarios, acting at his direction, kidnapped the DEA confidential source and 10 other victims in Mexico, including a U.S. citizen. Perez Salas believed the other victims worked for or were related to the confidential source. Of the 11 people taken, 8 were killed. The dead included the DEA confidential source and a 13-year-old boy. 3 of the kidnapped victims survived. The indictment states the killings were carried out in retaliation for the confidential source's provision of information to law enforcement in connection with the investigation of Perez Salas and his associates. Less than a month after that kidnapping, on November 22, 2023, Mexican National Guard officers arrested Perez Salas at a walled property in Culiacan, Sinaloa, at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon. President Biden, who was meeting with Mexican President López Obrador in San Francisco at the time, thanked Mexican authorities the same week. The DEA had posted a $3 million reward for his capture earlier that year. Former DEA head of international operations Mike Vigil described Perez Salas publicly as a complete psychopath. On May 25, 2024, Perez Salas was extradited from Mexico to the United States. He was arraigned in federal court in New York. He faces charges in 2 separate federal jurisdictions. In the District of Columbia, he is charged with cocaine and methamphetamine importation, firearms offenses, and conspiracy to obstruct justice through murder. The D.C. indictment's conspiracy to obstruct justice charge carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. In the Southern District of New York, he is charged with leading a continuing criminal enterprise resulting in the deaths of numerous victims, including the DEA confidential source, fentanyl importation and trafficking, obstruction of justice by murdering an informant, and kidnapping resulting in the deaths of 8 people, including a minor. The continuing criminal enterprise charge carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison. The firearms charges carry mandatory minimums of 30 years each. FBI Director Christopher Wray issued a statement at the time of his extradition, describing Perez Salas as the primary enforcer of the Sinaloa cartel's ruthless security apparatus. Attorney General Merrick Garland said the Justice Department would be relentless in its pursuit of the cartels responsible for flooding U.S. communities with fentanyl. The DEA's source, he is charged with murdering, and the 13-year-old boy killed alongside him, have no names in any public record. The case against Perez Salas remains ongoing. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case takes a different shape entirely. Rather than a cartel hunting down a named informant, it involves a former federal agent who testified publicly in an American courtroom, had his face shown on national television, and was then killed on the exact same calendar date, 10 years later, as the day the cartel first tried to burn him alive. Case 8. Ivan Morales Corrales. On the morning of May 1, 2015, the Mexican federal government launched a secret operation in the state of Jalisco. The mission was called Operación Jalisco. Its target was Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, known as El Mencho, the founder and leader of the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, known as the CJNG, and at that time, one of the most wanted men in Mexico. 5 helicopters carrying 18 agents flew toward the municipality of Villa Purificación. Ivan Morales Corrales was on one of them. He was a sub-officer with the Mexican Federal Police's Intelligence Division. He had at least 5 years of operational experience. What happened next was not a failed raid. It was an ambush. The CJNG had advanced knowledge of the operation. According to court testimony later given in a U.S. federal trial, El Mencho's son, Ruben Oseguera Gonzalez, known as El Menchito, gave the order to shoot the helicopters down to prevent his father's capture. Cartel members were waiting. They opened fire with military-grade weapons, including RPG-7 rocket launchers, a Browning M2 heavy machine gun, and a Barrett M82 anti-material rifle. The helicopter carrying Morales was hit by 4 rocket-propelled grenades, 2 of which struck directly. The aircraft caught fire, and the pilot managed a partial controlled descent before it crashed. 9 of the 18 people aboard died, most burned alive or killed by gunfire. A luxury belt for pistol magazines bearing El Menchito's initials was later found at the crash site. Morales made it out. He had no visible wounds when he hit the ground, but his uniform had caught fire. He removed his jacket and bulletproof vest and rolled on the ground until the flames went out. He then moved under fire with a 9mm pistol, his only remaining weapon, until he was rescued and airlifted to the Central Military Hospital in Mexico City. He was placed in a medically induced coma. When he woke up after months, one of the first things he said was that he was going to be a father and did not want to leave defeated. His face was permanently disfigured by the burns. He underwent 15 reconstructive surgeries. Doctors confirmed he had suffered third-degree burns over 70% of his body. In December 2015, then-President Enrique Peña Nieto awarded him the Police Medal of Merit, the Mérito Policial de Primera Clase, for his bravery. Morales became publicly known as a symbol of what the CJNG was capable of and what it cost individual officers to confront it. He gave interviews. He told his story on camera. His burned face became recognizable. He was, in the most direct sense, a man who could be identified. El Menchito was arrested in Mexico in June 2015, just weeks after the helicopter attack. He was extradited to the United States in February 2020. His trial was held in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia over 2 weeks in September 2024. One of the key witnesses was a former Mexican federal police officer, described in court records with identifying details matching Morales, a man with a burned, disfigured face who had survived the 2015 helicopter attack and testified about what happened that day. The witness testified anonymously using the name Juan Perez, a protection measure, but the description was specific enough that multiple Mexican media outlets reported he was Morales. On September 20th, 2024, the jury convicted El Menchito of conspiring to distribute cocaine and methamphetamine for importation into the United States and of using firearms and destructive devices in furtherance of those crimes. On March 7, 2025, U.S. District Judge Beryl Howell sentenced him to life plus 30 years in prison and ordered him to forfeit $6.26 billion in drug proceeds. He is currently held at ADX Florence, the federal supermax prison in Colorado. 54 days after that sentence was handed down, at approximately 8 o'clock in the morning on April 30, 2025, Ivan Morales Corrales and his wife were traveling in a black pickup truck in the Las Brisas neighborhood of Temisco, Morelos, about 60 miles south of Mexico City. A white pickup truck rammed their vehicle. Armed men got out and fired at least 15 shots into the cab. Both Morales and his wife were killed at the scene. The attackers fled on motorcycles they had staged nearby, abandoning their vehicle and weapons. The Morelos State Prosecutor's Office confirmed Morales' identity and opened an investigation, with revenge listed as the primary working motive. The date of his murder was April 30th. The helicopter had been shot down on May 1st, 2015. By the Mexican calendar, the attack that started his survival story happened on the same day that the attack ending his life occurred, exactly a decade later. He had survived fire, coma, surgeries, and years of recovery. He had walked into a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C., and testified with his burned face visible. The cartel waited 10 years and then sent motorcycles to a residential neighborhood on a Wednesday morning. El Mencho, his father, and the man Morales' helicopter had been trying to reach on the day of the attack, reportedly died in February 2026. He had never been captured. His son is in a supermax prison. The man who helped put him there is buried in Morelos. The final 2 cases in this series reveal the lengths cartels will go to kill informants who threaten them. One involving a man who disappeared without a trace while trying to protect others. The other, an Olympic athlete who built a cocaine empire and then put a bullet in someone who dared cooperate with the FBI. Case 9. Felix Batista. Felix Batista was born in Cuba. His family eventually settled in Miami as part of the large Cuban community there, and Felix built a career that took him across Latin America dozens of times a year. He was a former U.S. Army major who served 4 years on active duty, and he later served in the Florida Army National Guard as a commander of a military intelligence company. When he left the military, he moved into private security consulting and discovered a specific talent for one of the most difficult jobs in that field: negotiating the release of kidnapping victims. Over the course of his career, he worked for companies including Kroll Security, AIG, Henderson Risk Limited, St. Paul Travelers, Lloyd's, and ASI Global. He ran corporate seminars teaching executives how to reduce the risk of being taken. He assessed companies for security vulnerabilities. When someone was kidnapped despite those precautions, he was the one families called. He would move in with the victim's family, sometimes for months, coaching them through every call, every demand, every delay. He was, by all accounts, exceptionally good at it. By December 2008, ASI Global credited him with the successful resolution of nearly 100 kidnapping and ransom cases, dozens of them in Mexico. He traveled to Mexico at least 20 times a year. Saltillo, the capital of the state of Coahuila, sits about 250 miles south of the Texas border and had become a target-rich environment for organized kidnapping by 2008. The region was home to General Motors and Chrysler assembly plants, a relatively prosperous upper-middle class, and by that year, a serious cartel problem. Felix had worked with a previous Coahuila governor to significantly reduce kidnapping rates in the state. He knew the area well. In early December 2008, he traveled to Saltillo at the invitation of the state's public security authorities to give anti-kidnapping presentations to the local business community. He delivered talks in both Saltillo and Torreón. On the morning of December 10th, he met with officials from the state's public security office. That evening, he was having dinner with colleagues at one of Saltillo's best restaurants, El Mesón Principal del Norte, when one of his cell phones rang. The caller was Pilar Valdez, director of security for the Saltillo Industrial Group, and a friend and colleague of Felix. Valdez had been kidnapped that morning. Felix had spent the day working toward his release. The phone call was Valdez telling Felix he was free and that a car was being sent to bring Felix to him. Felix told his dining companions that several people in a white pickup truck were going to give him a message. One witness would later tell FBI Special Agent Alexandra Montilla that Felix knew something was wrong. Before leaving the table, he handed someone an emergency contact number and said if anything happened to him, to call it. Surveillance footage from inside the restaurant captured him leaving the table. A government camera outside the restaurant showed him getting into a car. Witnesses said he waited on the sidewalk for nearly 30 minutes before a white van pulled up and a man in uniform approached him in a friendly manner. Pilar Valdez was in the van, injured. Felix was taken. Valdez was dropped off by the roadside an hour later. Felix was never seen again. The FBI listed him on its Kidnapped Persons Wanted page and offered a reward of up to $25,000 for information leading to the identification, arrest, and conviction of those responsible. Coahuila state authorities told U.S. consular officials almost immediately that they believed the Zetas cartel was responsible. FBI. Special Agent Montilla confirmed this account, saying that Valdez told the FBI that the abductors asked specifically for Felix Batista by name, and that Valdez believed he had been used as bait. According to the classified U.S. State Department cable numbered 08MONTERREY565, released by WikiLeaks in 2010, Coahuila officials believed Batista was taken by the Zetas, described in the cable as the longtime enforcement arm of the Gulf Cartel. The same cable noted that U.S. consular officials were growing less optimistic with each passing day, given the ruthless nature of the Zetas, and stated plainly that the normal rules protecting American citizens in Mexico appeared to have changed in this case. A second State Department cable, numbered 09MONTERREY251, released by WikiLeaks, contained a more devastating disclosure. U.S. consular officials met with Coahuila Governor Humberto Morera approximately a month after the abduction. At that meeting, Morera and other state officials told the Americans what their intelligence had uncovered. According to the cable, they said Felix had been murdered a few days after his abduction and that his body had been disposed of by burning. They identified the Gulf Cartel's Saltillo Plaza boss, known as Tatanka, whose real name was Germán Torres Jiménez, as the intellectual author of the crime. Torres Jiménez was arrested by the Mexican military in April 2009 on separate drug trafficking charges. The separate WikiLeaks cable also confirmed what the FBI had suspected. The abductors believed Felix had been passing information on the drug cartels to Mexican federal law enforcement authorities. That cable, citing statements Pilar Valdez made directly to the FBI, used those exact words. Felix was not a sworn federal agent. He was not carrying a badge. He was a private consultant who helped families get their loved ones back. But the cartel believed he was cooperating with authorities, and they used his own professional instincts, his inability to walk away from a colleague in danger, to get to him. No body has ever been officially recovered. No death certificate has ever been issued. No one has ever been prosecuted for what happened to Felix Batista. His wife Lourdes held a press conference in Miami a month after his disappearance and begged his captors for mercy. His 5 children grew up without certainty about what happened to their father. His sister Jackie told reporters at that same press conference that the pain of not knowing was something she would not bestow upon her worst enemies. The FBI still carries his case as an open kidnapping. In the final case on this list, a former Olympic snowboarder who became the largest cocaine distributor in Canada found out that the FBI had a cooperating witness who could testify against him, and he put a $5 million bounty on that person's head before having them shot 5 times in the head at a restaurant in Colombia. Case 10. Ryan Wedding and the Federal Witness. Ryan James Wedding was born on September 14, 1981, in Thunder Bay, Ontario, Canada. His maternal grandparents owned Mount Baldy Ski Resort in Thunder Bay. His father was an engineer and a former competitive skier. When Ryan was 12, the family moved to the Greater Vancouver suburb of Coquitlam, British Columbia, which is where he began snowboarding seriously. He was talented. By 1999, he had won a bronze medal at the Junior World Championships in the parallel giant slalom. He won silver at the 2001 Junior World Championships. On February 14, 2002, he represented Canada at the Salt Lake City Winter Olympics. He finished 24th in the men's parallel giant slalom event, out of the medal positions, and that was the end of his competitive career. He attended Simon Fraser University briefly after the Olympics, dropped out after 2 years, and started speculating in real estate. By 2006, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police raided a property he was associated with called 18 Carat Farms, a 6,800-plant marijuana warehouse in a suburban area. There was not enough evidence to charge him, and he was not present at the time of the raid. By 2008, federal prosecutors say Wedding had moved from marijuana to cocaine as part of a drug trafficking organization based in Vancouver. In June 2008, Wedding and 2 associates traveled from Canada to San Diego, California to buy cocaine. The dealer they were meeting with was working undercover for the FBI. They were arrested after the deal was done. Investigators found approximately $100,000 in cash, hidden inside a piece of furniture in a Comfort Inn hotel room in Woodland Hills, connected to the deal. Wedding's 2 co-defendants pleaded guilty. Wedding took his case to trial. A jury found him guilty on November 30, 2009. He was sentenced to 48 months in federal prison. At his sentencing hearing, he invoked his Olympic background and told the court it was his personal goal to rebuild his reputation. He was released from federal custody on December 7, 2011. According to the federal indictment unsealed in 2024, the enterprise began not later than 2011, the same year he got out of prison. After his release, Wedding fled to Mexico. He became protected by the Sinaloa Cartel and known within its network by 3 nicknames: El Jefe, Giant, and Public Enemy. According to U.S. Attorney General Pamela Bondi, he became the largest distributor of cocaine in Canada. His operation moved approximately 60 metric tons of cocaine per year. The supply chain ran from Colombia by boat and plane to Mexico, then by semi-truck across the U.S.-Mexico border into Los Angeles area stash houses, and then north to Canada and other U.S. cities. The U.S. Treasury Department seized a rare 2002 Mercedes CL-KG-TR Roadster during the investigation, valued at $13 million, one of only 6 of that model ever manufactured. Among the murders Wedding is charged with directing are the November 20th, 2023 killings of a married couple in Caledon, Ontario, Canada, Jagtar Sidhu, 57, and Harbhajan Sidhu, 55, carried out in retaliation for a stolen drug shipment. A third family member survived the shooting with serious injuries. Another man, Mohammed Zafar, 39, was killed in May 2024. Andrew Clark, 34, Wedding's alleged second-in-command, was arrested in Mexico in October 2024 and extradited to the United States. On October 17, 2024, the same day that federal prosecutors publicly announced a superseding indictment against Wedding and 15 others, something else happened. According to prosecutors, Wedding's own attorney, a Canadian criminal barrister named Deepak Balwant Paradkar, 62, allegedly advised Wedding and Clark that if a federal witness in the case against them were killed, the federal charges against them would necessarily be dismissed. Wedding, according to the indictment, placed a bounty of up to $5 million on the witness in exchange for any person locating and killing that individual. He then used a now-defunct Canadian website called The Dirty News to post photographs of the witness and his wife to help his hired killers identify and locate the target. On January 31, 2025, the witness was followed to a restaurant in Medellin, Colombia. He was shot 5 times in the head and died instantly. The first assistant U.S. attorney for the Central District of California, Bill Assaley, said in a statement that Wedding placed the bounty on the victim's head in the erroneous belief that the victim's death would result in the dismissal of criminal charges against him, and added, he was wrong. On March 6, 2025, Wedding was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list. The State Department offered a $10 million reward for information leading to his arrest or conviction, later raised to $15 million in November 2025. FBI Director Kash Patel called him a modern-day iteration of Pablo Escobar. Attorney General Bondi said he controlled one of the most prolific and violent drug trafficking organizations in the world. In November 2025, 10 more defendants were arrested in connection with the witness murder, including Paradkar, the attorney who had allegedly advised Wedding to commit it. The U.S. Treasury Department sanctioned Wedding and 18 associates. Colombian national Carmen Yelinet Veloyes Flores, who ran a high-end prostitution ring in Mexico, was sanctioned specifically for helping Wedding locate and kill the witness. On the night of January 22, 2026, Mexican authorities arrested Ryan Wedding in Mexico City. He was flown to the United States and arrived in handcuffs at Ontario International Airport in Southern California. He appeared in federal court for the first time on January 26, 2026, wearing a tan jail jumpsuit with his ankles chained, and pleaded not guilty to all charges. His attorney disputed whether he had surrendered voluntarily or been apprehended. A trial date was set for March 24, 2026. By the time of his arrest, 36 people connected to his organization had been arrested. Investigators had seized more than 2,300 kilograms of cocaine, 44 kilograms of methamphetamine, 44 kilograms of fentanyl, 8 firearms, and more than $55 million in illicit assets. The federal witness he is charged with having killed, the person who was shot 5 times in the head at a restaurant in Medellin on January 31, 2025, has no name in any public court filing. He is listed only as the victim. A man who had cooperated with the FBI against one of the most violent cocaine trafficking organizations in the Western Hemisphere, and who was hunted down and killed using his own photograph posted on a website, remains unnamed. That is where this story ends, with a man who tried to help and paid for it, and whose name nobody knows. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.